So, many of you know that my head is exceedingly big. In addition to being the pastor of this great church, I also teach at Claremont Graduate University. And I also am the first vice moderator for the region, for this specific Southwest region. So I walk around a lot going, oh. Looking like someone who pretends to know everything. And yesterday, it was my intent to begin the deliberations that would lead to the worship services for the October 19th and 20th Regional Assembly that our assembly will have. As you know, our world and our country are polarized. Our young people are finding their voices. There's a lot going on. So there was a lot to plan for these worship services. And so I selected 6 of the brightest and best young theologians in our church. And I set up a conference call with them for yesterday. And making sure that I did not waste their time, because they also lead churches, are in school. I sent out an itinerary on Friday with the points we would be covering and the scriptural places they could look so they would be prepared and we could proceed. Well, I called the regional office, and the regional computer expert said, I will send you the link so that you can conduct your go-to meeting with these people from all around California, and they don't have to travel to you. I said, oh, that's great. And I called him back Friday and I said, I just want to make sure everything's going to go well, and I have the link and all will be well. He said, oh yes, you have the link, and if anything goes wrong, here's my cell phone number. So I came to the church yesterday morning to use the big computer, and I pulled it up, and sure enough, there was my chat room, and I laid my notes out, and my Bible out, and my book out so we could plan the next meeting, and I was ready to go on Saturday morning with my other folk. The trouble is that the computer genius who sent me the room to have the chat had sent all of the participants a different chat room. For those of you who understand computers, I was sitting in a chat room all by myself and had no idea where in cyberspace they were. And since I wasn't on my computer, had no idea how to find them. And so a craziness ensued. All my plans went out the window, my itinerary, everything was gone. It took me about 20 minutes to find them, relocate them, get everything going, try to pretend like I wasn't daunted by what had just happened, and proceed with the meeting. Well, we were going along, and about 10 minutes into the meeting, the power at Little White Chapel went out. Computers weren't working, and there was no way to get in touch with them, and everything was gone. And so I wrote them a note. When the computers came back on, I said, you have my sincere apologies. We will figure out when we can meet again. And I was very sad, very angry that this opportune time had passed. They wrote me back and they said, no worries, things happen. Thank you for sending the itinerary. Even though we don't have all of the information, we proceeded on with what we have. Here are the notes of the things we were able to accomplish, and we'll get back together. I was so proud. I was still struggling to get my huge ego out of the way. But I give God thanks and praise that even though they did not have all of the information, they went ahead with the work. That is where Jesus found his disciples today. He was struggling with them and trying to get them to understand what kind of Messiah he was. A man of peace and love and a way to think of God differently. And they were looking for a Messiah who would conquer the earth, drive out the Romans, drive the people out of the temple, and establish heaven on earth again. And so they couldn't hear him. But in the middle of all of this, he asked them at Caesarea Philippi, who do you say that I am? And they responded, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus knew they didn't understand everything about him, but they understood that That is the confession that we disciples make when we join the church. We ask, do you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? And when people make that affirmative response to that, we go forward, not understanding everything, not agreeing on hardly anything, but understanding who Jesus is. Theology means basically the study of God. That's what the word theology means. The Protestant Lutheran reformer by the name of Martin Luther contrasted two theological understandings of Jesus. One he called the Theologia Gloriae, or the theology of glory, and the other the Theologia Crucis, the theology of the cross. The theology of glory validates the disciples' vision of the Messiah and perhaps our whole 21st century Western world. The theology of glory basically says the Messiah, and therefore all who believe in the Messiah, never again have to suffer. There's a verse that was added to Amazing Grace long after Newton died, and it goes like this, and for many of us it's our favorite verse. The Lord has promised good to me. That is the Theologia Glory. Once our girl, or once our guy, or once our Messiah is in power, then everything will be right. Those of us who follow the victor will be set up for life. Our values will be the right values because our way of life is the right way of life. And as for those who don't adhere to our victor, to our God, to our vision of God, well, perhaps they deserve to suffer because they foolishly chose the wrong way. Sometimes for us Christians, it is easier to look back at the gentle Jesus coming on the scene, a Middle Eastern Jew, meek and mild, teaching and preaching and feeding and healing, or look ahead to the triumphant Jesus Christ, part of the eternal God in heaven, ready to welcome us home and turn our eyes away from the Jesus that Mark has drawn in this gospel. The one who started his ministry with the full knowledge that John the Baptist had been arrested and John the Baptist would be beheaded, and the way to Christ's death would be filled with suffering. Jesus was always found with the blind, those who had leprosy, those who had demons, tax collectors. Jesus' ministry was not ever about reaching out to the governors of the law and to temple officials and to successful actors and to lotto winners. Jesus' ministry, Jesus' life, was about suffering with those who had suffered and had nowhere else to come. Jesus was never the Christ of Easy Street. Jesus was telling his slow-to-understand disciples about the other theology that Luther had delineated, the Theologia Crucis, the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering, the way of the cross. Just as John had suffered before him, just as the Jewish people had suffered at the hands of the Romans and the temple officials, Jesus was talking about suffering. And not just suffering, but enduring suffering. And not just enduring suffering, but going through suffering to more closely see God. This past Tuesday, the crowd of homeless men and women lined up along the Santa Ana River Trail to collect motel vouchers before bidding goodbye to Orange County's largest homeless camp. Any of you read about that this week? They were going to be moved into housing. Hope for those who were suffering. U.S. District Judge David Carter, who had coordinated this move, walked the Santa Ana River Trail himself, and after seeing it, ordered that the evacuation of the homeless be done humanely and with dignity. But do you think this ended suffering for these homeless folk? Sure, it's freezing cold outside. Sure, it's germ-infested outside, and most likely it's dangerous. Can you imagine how many people in that camp contracted the flu and died from it? But it was familiar. It was a place of rest. And when some of the people heard about the changes coming, they became so frightened that they ran away rather than accept help because they didn't have any control over it. And so those who were left standing in line for vouchers and then moving into new quarters with new neighbors and new rules, not being in charge of the transportation of their own belongings, being considered by the whole rest of LA and the world charity cases, where at any moment in their new housing the rules could still change. At any moment the laws that benefited them could change and they could be out on the street again. That does not sound like the end of suffering. This is the place where you will find Jesus. I want to tell you about a new friend of mine. His name is Silas. Silas is 13 years old. Silas has ADHD, as just about every 13-year-old boy does. Silas is also dyslexic. He is a cheerful, wonderful little boy. Not so little anymore, young adult. A few weeks ago, his dad, as a result of the DACA, has not been deported yet, but he has lost his job, his father. And so the economic turmoil in their house has increased. As we continue to lift up the young people in Parkland, Florida, Silas is one of those young people who is suffering along with them some 1,200 miles away, but he is afraid to go to school because he doesn't feel safe. Silas came in last week to his mom, and he has a wonderful mom. She takes him for 2 hours a week to an art class where they participate together, and his dyslexia is outside, and his ADHD is outside, and they're just doing art together. He came into his mom last week and he said, Ara, can I have a knife to take to school? I am frightened that I will. Well, his mother said, she wanted to say, son, that is nonsense. You can't take a knife to school. But she wasn't convinced that he wasn't right. But she told him no. And so a few days later, he came and he said, Mom, can I at least have a scooter to take to school? Because then I have a better chance of outrunning a bullet. Children are suffering because we haven't made them safe. And the laws of privilege and marginalization are the same whether we're dealing with racial segregation, whether we're dealing with the LGBTIQ community, whether we're dealing with women's issues, whether we're dealing with anything where some people don't feel safe and other people are not willing to give up their privilege to make them feel safe. That's the place where Jesus is, with men and women and little children looking for scooters who are suffering. God, in terms of our society, an American writer once wrote, doing what's right is the hardest thing in the world. We pray that you will help us do what is right. We were all children once. We know what it's like to be frightened. And we're thankful that there was some adult who was there to see us through to adulthood. Help us to see you in all of our struggles and never fail to do what is right for our children. In your Son's name we pray.